So here, as I said, you've got this demo video of some of the generations made by the new SORA model that was launched by OpenAI last week. It is a very interesting model. I think the most interesting thing about its launch was actually the timing, because it came 2 hours after Google announced a major step forward in their model as well. Some good pettiness on behalf of OpenAI there, yeah? Like not giving Google a couple of hours in the sun, but we can talk about all of that as time goes on. The first slide, yeah, I'm Rakesh Murria, COO. I work for Ascension. We're an early stage technology investor in the EIS and SEI space. We've been investing in technology businesses for 9 years now, and we've had 13 exits, positive exits over the last couple of years, or 2 or 3 years now. And we have a tax efficient review score of 86 for our Ascension EIS. And we also won the UK Seed VC of the Year in 2022 at the UK BAA Investment Awards. I'm just going to leave this up here. So today I'm going to cover a few different bits off around artificial intelligence and what it means and what's going on in general. I think the other thing that I'm also going to do is just give a sort of quick market context background to it all. Some of you have seen this, some of you haven't, but it's great to be able to talk about the different technologies and what's happening, but I work in venture capital. Part of my job is to give you our perspective on what that landscape looks like as an industry, irrespective of whether we're talking about a certain technology or not. And so the first thing I'm going to do is basically touch on market dynamics as we see them in the market. So we had what we feel were a couple of abnormal years in the venture capital industry in 21-22, extremely frothy, super high competition to get into rounds. And since then, what we consider to be a lot of tourist VCs, is a great phrase that someone taught me, tourist VCs have left the market. So we had American funds deciding they were European funds. We had later stage funds deciding they were early stage funds. And what we're seeing from our perspective is things much more back to what we consider normal kind of levels of interesting businesses to look at for a start off, or more businesses than that, but like lots of interesting businesses to look at, but valuations back where they were, so somewhere more reasonable, and like a much more stable and less frothy market, a much more rational market, which we think is great when it comes to investing. Another thing that we've seen, which has an impact, and you wouldn't really think about, oh, why am I talking about tech layoffs? But the fact that have been quite a lot of layoffs and shedding of the overhiring that happened in 21 and 22 is that there are a lot of people in the tech industry, capable people, who either have been laid off because businesses downsizing or replacing complete functions that they have that they don't want anymore. But the other thing that's happening is that there are individuals out there, highly qualified, very capable, that have share options that aren't really worth anything anymore. And actually, those kinds of lock-ins that you may have had that would keep people with you in a tech company, if they don't really have any value, then actually people start to leave and look for something new to do because there's nothing to lock them into where they were. On top of that, I think one of the things that specifically for advisors, I've talked about this before with anyone that I've met, is I think that we've seen that people who have older investments, right? Investments from 2018, 2019 may have seen significant markups on those investments in late 2020 and 2021 during that frothy period that I talked about. And that those high markups were probably being replaced maybe a year or two later when a subsequent funding round happens with down rounds versus those things. And it's a bit like house prices. Your investment may well be worth more than it was in 2019 or 2018 or the kind of older vintage that I'm talking about. It then had a sort of skyrocketing period that made you feel super rich, and then it goes down again, makes you feel poorer. And obviously, we think that's going to be on people's minds in terms of where things are at. But again, the counterpoint to that is that for new investments, the entry valuations are much more reasonable. So investors coming in, now's the time to look at it. And this is not a phrase I've coined myself, but I've heard other people say that we think that we'll look back on 2024 as what a great year that was to invest. And then the last thing that we think is going to really help drive that is a fundamental technology shift that's taking place. So we've got a new foundational technology in artificial intelligence, the subject of this talk. And the question is going to be, is it as big as the smartphone, which was pretty big? Is it going to be as big as the PC, which was also incredibly big? Or is it going to be as game-changing as something like aeroplanes? And aeroplanes might be like a really weird example to give. They completely changed the global supply chain and the way people work and the way people are with each other, in terms of how you were able to just humble brag looking at going to Japan for my the Easter holidays, when my parents would have done that, they would have taken a boat, and most of the time would have been spent trying to get there. But now I can be there in 15 hours, and it completely changes the way that we live our lives. And that's what's going to be what happens with AI. We think that together with tourist VCs gone, new founders coming to market, new founders starting new businesses, and an amazing technology that can actually make them much more effective as people and make teams much more effective, we think it's like a great time to invest. And again, one of those things that's fairly well known, but just putting it together, the idea that we've seen quite fundamental downturns and technology shifts leading to completely huge changes in economic growth and also some amazing winners. And so I've given some examples here of 1999 plus was when like the internet became a thing, and it created, we also had a bit of a crisis going on, the dot-com bubble burst at the same time. But the kinds of companies that came out of that, lastminute.com from the UK, for example, Amazon, Google, created some incredible businesses. In 2008, we had the financial crisis driven by mortgage-backed securities. Experiences. We have the financial crisis in the US, but at the same time, that same year, actually, the iPhone came to market in mid-2007, and we had the smartphones and cloud technology, and we created some really interesting new businesses, both here and in the US, again, in terms of major winners. And 2022 plus, in November 2022, was when ChatGPT went out to market for people to try it out. Artificial intelligence has been around for a while. It was the first time it really captured the imagination of people, and who are going to be the winners. And that is my little attempted positioning down here is no image available. Who's going to win yet? And I'm probably at some point going to give you some of my favorite companies right now in this space and talk to you about those as we go on. So have a pen and paper ready or a notepad, because I'm going to give you like my bits of gold of the kinds of AI applications that I use 10 times a day, for example, already right now. So that's the preamble. So let's get started. This is, again, if anyone's watched this demo video that I've done, you probably haven't seen this slide, but the first bit that I really want to talk about is we've tried artificial intelligence all these times, etc. I'm going to go into that in a second and the different kinds of artificial intelligence. But as long as we've had computers, we have had attempts at doing artificial intelligence. And as I said, Alan Turing, the 1950s, the Turing test. But what do we mean by a computer doing it? Really, what we're talking about is artificial neural networks, which is chips that try to copy what the brain does in terms of making linkages between interconnected nodes. So in the brain, that's a neuron, and on a silicon chip, it's an artificial neuron. And the idea being is that you try to create these connections, weight these connections together. Basically, by learning over and over again, you get things that are reinforced in your brain in terms of, if I, as a child, you'll probably see, if I have a cup of water and I try to stick my head in it like this, it won't work for drinking, but if I pull it back like that, it will work. And eventually you're creating the memory, literally the muscle memory or the physical memory in your brain about how this works, trying to create those connections and basically replicate what our brain does in meat in silicon. And that is what an artificial neural network does. And we've been trying this for many years. The big thing that's really happened now is that we can fit a lot of them in a small space. People may have heard of Moore's law, doubling the number of transistors on a chip. Moore's law will get used for everything, but the idea being that you can now fit significantly more capacity on a small space means that from a compute perspective, these things that we're trying are also getting more capable as well. As I said, we've been trying it for a really long time. And in essence, the first way that we have tried to do artificial intelligence is that we have done rules-based artificial intelligence. So if you want to sound all posh, that is called heuristics. I don't know if you ever heard that phrase, but heuristics intelligence. But basically, that is like giving a set of instructions to a computer and trying to get them to follow it. And the thing is about these instructions that it's actually really difficult to do these instructions in a clear way, right? Or there's a lot of stuff that you think is common sense that isn't actually common to other things other than us, because we just have so much data that our bodies, our senses, our smell, our touch, all these things have done. And so when we say, the example I give for artificial intelligence using this allegory that I'm going to do today of self-driving cars is it's the equivalent of giving someone the manual to the car, giving someone the highway code and saying that you can drive. And I have a number of siblings. One of them didn't pass their driving test until they're 38. I can tell you, and they tried quite a few times, I can tell you that kind of, let's just give somebody the rules, let's just give a computer the rules. It doesn't work for people. It doesn't work for computers. And it's been a real kind of challenge in how computing worked for a very long time, which was like, we can just come up with enough rules. And effectively what we talk about in this is every time you reach an edge case, and there are a lot more edge cases than there are the ability to program them out in terms of how to deal with it. So in the 2000s, we made some kind of really interesting breakthroughs in terms of how we can get computers to learn things. And these neural networks, first of all, they had enough capacity within the chip or with a collection of chips to do things. But secondly, we learned about other ways of going about it. And one of those things that we did was we got into the field of kind of machine learning, and as part of that, learning from data. And one of the most interesting things about learning from data is we did the grunt work. We labeled the data for a computer. Again, you will have seen this before possibly, but on the right-hand side is the 2015 state-of-the-art machine vision test. And basically you can see here that test was, can you determine the difference between a chihuahua and a cupcake? And I actually showed this video to somebody the other day, and they did not realize that any of them were in fact chihuahuas. They thought they were all cupcakes until I pointed out that, can you tell the difference between each? And the way that we taught a computer to do this was that we would label thousands of items of data, in fact, even more sometimes, and basically then use a computer to say, here are 500,000 examples of a dog and 500 examples of a cupcake. Here is the next image. Can you tell me whether it's a dog or a cupcake? And that was the state-of-the-art test in 2015. I find it quite funny. Hopefully you do too. But bringing it back to self-driving cars, what does that look like when it comes to self-driving cars? I'm going to come back to it in a second. So sorry, by the way, this is supervised learning, yeah? So the idea being is that we have labeled and given the computer a set of answers that it can learn from and then say, infer the next answer, please, for me. And that's called supervised learning. And when it comes to cars, as I said, the idea being is that we have spent a lot of time labeling, is this a traffic light? Is this a motorcycle? Is this a coach? Is it a bus? And I don't know if you're the only one, but I've certainly been in this situation, which is, do I actually call that or not? How accurate am I supposed to be here? Am I going to get in trouble with the computer? And if I don't get it wrong, am I a robot? Or if I get it, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's very interesting that this kind of stuff that Google's been doing, they have a self-driving car company called Waymo. Waymo operates in San Francisco. I don't know if any of you have been out there recently, but in San Francisco, Waymo operates self-driving cars, completely robotic self-driving cars that operate as robo-taxis, and they are allowed to pick you up from the airport and take you anywhere in San Francisco. There were two companies, Waymo and Cruise. There's been some really interesting stories about what happened. You may have seen something in the news about Cruise are no longer allowed to operate in San Francisco, for example, and that was because there was an accident in which somebody was killed. And if you read the papers, you'll see that the accident would say, they were killed in a collision due to a collision with a driverless car. But what actually happened was there was a hit and run accident where one driver, a real person, knocked a person over, unfortunately knocked them into the path of a Waymo, which then hit them again because it didn't know they were about to land on top of it. And the terrible part of what happened was the Waymo was trying to its programming was, I need to pull over because something bad's happened. And unfortunately, the person was still there. And so it then pulled over and drove over them as well in it. These things are real and happening, but we haven't reached the level of safety of a human driver yet, which I think is very interesting in terms of where things are at. So for example, it takes, I think you go 100 million miles before a fatality on average for a human driver. So far with Waymo and Cruise, they have got an accident, shall we say, or an accident involving a person. And I think with Waymo, they are about 10 million miles now that they do, but they're improving incredibly quickly. And again, San Francisco, probably the only place that's just going to let robo-taxis drive around. And again, one of the interesting things was also in America, let's just have a riot and set fire to one of these Waymo cars. Let's just express our freedom of, where am I going with this? I'll stop. So next thing I'm going to do is talk about the big breakthrough that happened in artificial intelligence. So we've talked about kind of machine learning, supervised learning, and how it worked. And then there was a kind of breakthrough paper in 2017 called Attention is All You Need. And it used the term, or the kind of technical term, multi-headed attention, where it's an algorithmic breakthrough to allow you to teach an AI how to learn for itself. Self-supervised learning, it's called. And I'm going to get into a bit of how that works. So I'm not going to get hugely into the technicalities of transformers and why they're better than various other architectures, but I'm going to try to give you a sort of an easy explanation of how the transformer model works. And this area of learning is called self-supervised learning. And the reason it's called self-supervised learning is because you basically take a piece of text, a corpus of text. So for example here, and the example I used before is, imagine that you had a book. You take a book and you break it down into chunks, and then you have computer A and computer B. And by the way, computer A and computer B aren't real separate computers. That is the transformer model acting as computer A and computer B. And what it does is it sends the data across from computer A to computer B, but plays what I would call blankety blank. So it basically is masking one of the words here. So for example, you can see in this example, an apple is a sweet blank fruit that grows on trees. And that input is given to the transformer model. The transformer makes a guess. And so an apple is a sweet, comma, what? And then it picks from a number of words. And fruit that grows on trees, and then basically based on the word that it put in, so let's say it wrote the word EIS, I wonder why I chose that, it would score negatively. It would say, no, you didn't do a good job of that, no, take another guess. And you keep doing it over and over again for lots of different strings of tokens. And what happens is underneath all that is that basically you're training the computer to build a world model. So you do it here for this kind of this text that we did, this small book, for example, where you can say, I can guess, I can understand the book and I can guess it. But ChatGPT 3.5, the thing that came to market in November 21, basically took the entire corpus of text of the internet and trained trillions of times through this model. So the estimates are that in terms of compute, and I just mean compute, I don't mean the people running it or anything else, $40 million is the low end estimate, $100 million is the high end estimate of how much it cost to basically read everything on the internet, break it up into these chunks, run it through these transformers trillions of times across hundreds of thousands of things. It took 3 to 4 months to do this. So you can imagine that the computers are literally just whirring away consistently for 2 to 3 months to allow them to build this world model. So they create these emergent properties of building an underlying world model. And what does an underlying world model mean? Look at that video that I was playing you at the start. Can it understand it's not understanding the concept of physics by reading about physics and saying, I read the book, now I understand physics, but by reading so much that it gets an idea that things fall down, not up. It read so much information and data that it understands that the color spectrum looks like this, and these are the kinds of colors in between. And it builds this world model underneath where basically you have this pre-trained computer that will basically understand and has learned using matrix multiplication, by the way. It's all maths. The whole thing is basically maths. Using matrix multiplication, it has understood the world at an underlying level so that you can ask it questions and it will answer them. And again, one of the things that I think is super interesting about this is we call this self-supervised learning. The idea that the computer learned itself, and the reason the computer learned itself because it did this computer A, computer B thing. But during that self-supervised learning in terms of what it's doing, it has got very capable of answering anything. And actually, we now have to have people to train the other end because this computer will tell you anything. And one of the examples I gave before was like, you could ask this computer literally anything. And it would say, what's the best way for me to work out how to scam my best friend's bank account details out of him so I can steal his money? And a pre-trained model with no human feedback yet will go, oh, okay, from what I understand, this is the best way to do it. How can I hotwire a car? Here's how you do it. And it will literally just give, because these models are trained to be polite and just answer questions. And so basically you ask a question and it will answer it for you. And one of the things that has been quite a big impact of that, or the big sort of knock-on of that, is that they do this thing called RLHF, which is reinforcement learning by human feedback, which is there are literally thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of people that are paid to sit and ask these chatbots questions to basically see if it will answer questions it shouldn't, right? And if it will do things it shouldn't. And if it does do things it shouldn't, it will basically report it, and they will basically try to give the model instructions, don't answer questions like this in future. And it's one of the biggest areas that you've seen. For example, those videos that we saw earlier on, these amazing videos, it's very easy to see how generate me a video of Joe Biden doing X or Trump doing something here, and it will just generate them for you unless it doesn't really have a filter. And literally, this human feedback is a way of giving it a filter. And then bringing that back again to self-driving cars, this time by a meme, which is the Galaxy Brain meme, if you know about it. So basically, if you have, here are the instructions model, it doesn't work very well when it comes to cars. You can't just give it the highway code and expect it to drive. It will not go anywhere, if very far at all. The big thing where Tesla had been miles ahead of the game for a number of years was machine vision push instructions. We've talked about labeling that data. That Tesla understands what's a lorry, what's a car, what's a motorbike, what's a pedestrian. But then it says, when you see a particular situation, do this. And those of you that have a Tesla, I think I know a couple of you in the audience do. I'm one of them as well, as obviously I have to let you know. It's a rule. I have to tell you that I have a Tesla. Anytime the car sort of beeps at you that you're doing something wrong, or if you have it in self-driving mode and you grab the steering wheel because you don't feel it's doing it something right, that basically sends a message back to Tesla, to the programmers to say, oh, this situation, the driver intervened. Let's see what happened. Oh, okay, do we need to adjust our code in terms of how to do it? And they built up a 300,000 line of code in terms of instructions to follow when it found different things. And I don't know if any of you have used self-driving from Tesla when it's like this, but it is terrible. It is awful to use. Not that it can't do it, it just feels completely inhuman. When it comes up to a stop sign, the car will come to a stop 15 feet before the stop sign. It will then creep at 1 mile per hour until it gets to the stop sign. It will then wait until there is a gap that it can get into of a specific size. And if it isn't that gap, it will not go. And there are lots of videos of the cars, Tesla cars, just stopping or not doing anything or not understanding what happens. It generally will get you there, but it just gets you there in such a robotic and unhuman feeling way that very often people grab the steering wheel. And then in April 2023, having seen what was happening with the transformer model, Tesla basically tried it out. So they have 8 cameras, I think it is, on the car, the front, the side, the back, etc. And they give, believe it or not, I don't know if you know this, but you get a score from the car as to how good a driver you are. You actually get a Tesla score, which you can find if you look for it. And they took Tesla score, drivers with a Tesla score of 4.9 and above, 4.9 or 4.5 out of 5 stars. And they basically took those millions of hours of video from all those different drivers and ran it through a transformer model, where in this case, what they do is they're graining out some of the video. They take a picture and they actually make that picture worse quality and ask the model to fill in what's there as well. And then basically by teaching it millions of hours of video, they would give the car a scenario and say, what would you do here? And they did, Elon Musk himself did a 45-minute self-driving demo back in August, probably the best demo that I've ever seen them do. And I've now seen real people who have Teslas in America that aren't Tesla employees that have version 12 of self-driving, and it is a sign of the future. It feels much more realistically close. And one of the things is they had to throw away 300,000 lines of code now. So what happens is at this point, what's really interesting, how does it work in terms of training? So let's say before you had these instructions, Rakesh grabbed the wheel, therefore I need to look at it and code something different. Now if Rakesh grabs the wheel, they need to say what was happening, and then they need to say, can we give more examples of that situation and what you should do to the machine? Because you don't just, there is no code. You cannot say, when you see this, do this. You literally have to say, oh, okay, I see you're struggling with that. I'm going to give you revision. I'm going to give you more learning in this space until you get it right. Okay, so that should cover off most of the stuff that you've seen and may have picked up at the start of what was happening before with my kind of short intro video and giving you a bit more of a deep dive into that. The other thing that I'm now going to talk about is AI has made things so interesting in so many ways. Who would have thought about it? And so one of the things that I think is super interesting is that digesting the internet, which is basically what these models have been doing, isn't cheap. And it made the whole area of chips interesting again. When I was 16 years old and thought I was extremely cool, when in actual fact I was not extremely cool, I was a moron. I was building my own computers as a kid. Rather than buy them off the shelf, I'd buy the components and I'd buy the different bits because I could save myself like 40 quid or whatever by doing it, or 400 quid more like by doing it myself. The chips and everything about them were so interesting. And then basically Intel, do you remember Wintel, the phrase? Windows and Intel, the kind of the unbreakable bond between them. And that was just how computers were going to work. And then it all got thrown out the window when phones came along, and those kind of chips were boring. And then basically phone chips got better and everyone takes it for granted. We've had a significant change in what chips are interesting for now, right? They're interesting for learning stuff. And NVIDIA, who you've probably heard of by this point, in 2013, NVIDIA had a market capitalization of 9.1 billion. And I think as of yesterday or whatever, that is 1.7 trillion. I hope you bought NVIDIA shares back then. But NVIDIA is a company that makes chips for gaming. And the reason that they became so successful was because that same kind of chip that you use for gaming is basically doing matrix multiplication, maths on a massively parallel scale, and that is what AI does. And it turns out that this has made NVIDIA extremely rich. You've all probably heard of it, NVIDIA. The next one that I think is super interesting is ASML. So I don't know if you've heard of ASML or not. They are a Dutch company that is basically the monopoly provider of what is called extreme ultraviolet lithography machines. So the chips that we use have got more and more compact, as I said. They use this nanometer scale production. So when I bought, the last time I cared about a nanometer was about 2013, 2010 maybe. I bought a computer and it was on a 45 nanometer chip scale, which was the market leading edge. And at the time, they thought the lowest they're going to get to was like 20 nanometers. Like that's going to be the absolute limit that we can get to. ASML now print chips or do the ultraviolet lithography for chips at a 3 nanometer scale. And the only chip that exists in people's hands at the moment, anyone that has an iPhone 15 Pro has a chip at a 3 nanometer scale. And why is that important? Basically, there's less space wasted. So on a piece of silicon, you have a ton more capacity there to compute. So I don't know if you've heard of ASML, but they are basically a monopoly in this space. I think there are not many other companies in this that can do what they do at all. So everybody that fabricates chips uses ASML's technology. And there are export controls on ASML's technology. So I don't know if people heard of the CHIPS Act in America, but basically there is a geopolitical sort of standoff between the US and China about them having the ability to monetize and build AI systems and what they might build them for. And so basically we have cut off China's ability to buy chips at these lower nanometer scales. So NVIDIA are not allowed to sell them their best chips. ASML are not allowed to sell Chinese manufacturers their chips. And TSMC, which is the final one at the bottom, which you may or may not have heard of, they are a company called Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Business company. They actually make the chips pretty much in all these things that we're talking about. They make NVIDIA's chips, they make Apple's chips at these cutting edge foundries. Until 2 years ago, they didn't have a foundry outside of Taiwan, which is why Taiwan's become such a strategically important place in the world. As of a year and a half ago, I think they opened their first plant in Texas, and that was basically because the US mandated that they had to if they wanted to keep working with us. But there's been a huge and really interesting kind of thing going on in that space. Now, I'm not giving financial advice here, but you guys or lots of people probably buy things from other places in terms of may invest in stocks and shares, and you may or may not have invested in these companies. They've gone up in valuation a hell of a lot, and they may or may not go up further. I don't know. There's the conflicting views. But who are the competitors to these people? Interestingly, Canon, of all people, the photo company, Canon think that they have got something that allows them to compete with ASML. So there's a really interesting press release they put out a couple of weeks ago. Speculators or whatever, I was having a chat with the team about who's my alternate sort of ASML champion challenger model. I think it could end up randomly being Canon, and it might be something that I think I'm going to invest in Canon if I can. And TSMC have got a competitor, a new whippersnapper on the block that might finally be able to build chips along the kind. Their name is Intel. So Intel are coming back. They've invested 40 billion in building new foundries to build chips that can do AI. And as I said, there's this whole thing about national security controls, export controls. Basically, like Taiwan has become like one of the most strategically important places in the world. China's claim over Taiwan has suddenly become like a massive important thing. And then there's also the dominance of ASML and NVIDIA. NVIDIA in particular have been extremely aggressive in trying to buy up all of the fabrication of what happens. So anytime someone opens a new foundry, NVIDIA say, we will prepay for all the chips to try to build it because they just can't build enough. They want as much capacity as possible. And I think we'll very soon start seeing regulatory scrutiny around these companies because they basically have monopolies in what is going to be considered one of the most important spaces going. And then we've had tons of breakthroughs. So you've seen the video earlier on, right? But I think the kinds of breakthroughs that we're talking about there's so many of them. I just want to give you a few examples. This slide, you can see the date on it is 29th November 2023. So it is 2 months old and it's massively out of date, right? But I'll give you some examples. 2 things from Google. One is that they have actually, Google DeepMind used to use a Cray supercomputer to do weather forecasting. They created a neural network that can basically do accurate weather prediction, as accurate as a supercomputer, but on a desktop PC, right? You can have access to world-leading weather models as of now, using a really interesting and novel method, which I won't get into, I'll get into a tiny bit, which is an AI large language model, or an AI coming up with ideas and another AI sort of executing those ideas and constantly doing it in a loop. DeepMind, again, produced a database of 48,000 crystal structures that are useful in the purpose of creating batteries, right? So 48,000 unknown previously to man, or undiscovered to man, ideas to look at in the space of battery technology and chip technology in general. And I think they roughly said that that was the equivalent of 680 years of scientific endeavor if we had gone about it at the speed that we go about now for looking at crystal structures. And I think we're going to see a kind of a general acceleration of how things work over the next few years. And it doesn't come out its downsides, right? So this chart here is from the FT. I think it's a really interesting chart, which was basically how the generative landscape of AI is taking white collar jobs and wages already in the freelancing world, right? Before and after ChatGPT, the change in monthly freelancing jobs, you can see 5 months later, down 3%, and what they paid. There is an interesting space coming here. I don't know how many of you people pay for a copywriter to start with, or how many of you go, let's see what I can get if I ask one of these models to do it for me to start with. So I'm going to now give a few predictions for the next year, and then talk about the kind of things that we might look for when it comes to investing. First of all this stuff that I've talked about, it still might not feel real to you, in terms of if you use your phone and you go on your phone and you go into photos, you can search for somebody, or say, show me pictures of a cat, or show me pictures from when I was in China, and it will do that for you. That is AI doing that for you. It's data labeling, and it's worked it out itself. But some of the things that you're going to start to see are your email platform that you have, Microsoft Office with Copilot, Google with Duet. Actually, they're going to try to really help you do your day-to-day job, do your spreadsheet for you, make your spreadsheet easier to use, et cetera, right? You're going to see a lot of that coming over the next few months. We're going to see these models like ChatGPT and Google Gemini massively accelerate. Google released Gemini Ultra, so many terrible names, but Google Gemini Ultra in 2 weeks ago, and a week and a half later, they launched Google 1.5, right, as a model. And that basically is incredible in terms of its capability. So some of the demos I've seen, they give it a silent film, a Charlie Chaplin film, an entire film to watch, and then they basically ask questions via drawings and say, what's this? Or explain what happens at this point in the plot. And the model is able to understand what's happening. And you can see the kind of video generation tools is happening as well. But the other thing that's going to happen is, like, open source models that exist are maybe 6 months behind, right? So the best open source model that exists now is better than ChatGPT was when it launched in November 2021, which is crazy, right? In terms of completely available, free to use, build it yourself, use it on your own compute infrastructure. We're going to see lots of stuff happening with words, pictures, and videos, which you can already see. And my craziest point that I'll probably make that you should expect to see is there's a lot happening in robotics now, because with the ability to train data, with the ability to make up your own data using AI as well, it's been one of the most really interesting areas that's been going. Is that embodiment, as I've written here, is I think you'll see some really interesting breakthroughs in robotics, not in consumer hands, but certainly much better demos of what you would have seen that a robot can do. And so I'm going to finish this off, from my perspective at least, with what does that look for when a company like us is investing? Our perspective is, some people are like, oh, ChatGPT is going to replace everything. AI is going to replace everything. It's not, right? But it's certainly going to accelerate and change it's going to change certain industries completely, and it's going to accelerate and enable people to be much better at what they do in other places. So, for example, the way I describe it is MailChimp, right? People here may use MailChimp when they do a big mail outs or newsletters, etc. Imagine that somebody says, I've built a new AI that writes really nice emails that are really nicely formatted, yeah? And that's why I'm going to destroy MailChimp. And you're like, MailChimp have the ability to send 2 billion emails a day with complete deliverability, complete tracking and audit and all that stuff. Have you built all that stuff, or have you just built the ability for the emails to look nice? And who's going to get there first? Like the race to the start line, as the way I've heard it described. Who's actually going to get there first? Are you, having built this like nice feature that makes the email look nice, going to be able to build all of the infrastructure below it first? Or is Inuit, or whoever they are who own them, going to be MailChimp, going to be able to build that kind of better formatting, better email writing capability? And so if you think about it that way, If you're the cherry on top of a cake, we don't expect you to do it. Be successful. The other thing we don't expect you to be successful is if you're a fairly obvious feature of an AI that we expect to be replaced. No, in America, a year and a half ago, all the businesses that were being invested in were like, talk to your PDF, right? I'm going to be you give me a PDF and I'm going to cut it into chunks and analyze it and then pass that to an AI, and then you can do something with it. You can ask it a question. And now with ChatGPT, with Google Gemini, you can just upload a PDF, upload a movie, upload the whole thing and just give it to it. And if you're an extremely obvious function of an AI, I want to give you my Excel spreadsheet, can you fix it for me? Or I've got a problem with this, can you do it for me? We think it's not likely for you to work. However, if you have unique and specialized data, if you're completely transforming the way an industry works, then we think there's going to be so much scope to use these foundation models to do that. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of this in some of our investments. So we actually have an AI platform called Curate, which we also hope to be investing from our KI fund, which uses AI to basically analyze the data in complex diseases to help with treatment. We have a product that improves product engineering in terms of prototyping of the different kinds of structures that you would build, so that you only build the one that's going to work, right? Something used by like Mercedes Formula One, for example, to improve their throughput and building of the right quality of product. And that's using like unique data and specialized data to do things. We also have something like 5D AI, and one of the things not on here, which basically takes the idea of building in the real estate industry and takes all of those processes that happen and all the different documents, etc., and pulls them all together and basically make sure you step through the entire process, A, extremely quickly, and B, extremely accurately. So pulling in, understanding the planning rules, understanding what needs to happen, understanding what you've got with the plot, understanding all your bills and materials, etc., and basically enabling people to work much quicker. And people at Countrywide are using that product today to completely change the way they work. We've completely taken something that was email, database, blah, 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 and totally revolutionized the tech stack. And they're the kinds of things that we think are going to work. So I appreciate that it is like 20 seconds to go. I do have time for questions. Hopefully I didn't smash people to bits with far too much information. Possibly, yes, I need to learn to tone it down a bit, but it was really great to have you with us. And if you've got any questions whatsoever, please feel free to ask myself or Matt.